Senator Gillibrand, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Christiane. It's great to be on.
So, as I said, this is an extraordinary moment, an unprecedented time in American politics, and the world is gripped by this saga. I mean, here it now takes aim squarely at President Trump as this whole MeToo movement, gains momentum. Should the White House be worried?
Well, President Trump should resign. These allegations are credible. They are numerous. I've heard these women's testimony, and many of them are heartbreaking. And President Trump should resign his position. Whether he will ever hold himself accountable is something you really can't hold your breath for. And so Congress should have hearings. They should do their investigation. They should have appropriate investigations of his behavior and hold him accountable.
So you are standing by your prominent senator colleagues, Senator Cory Booker and others who have called today for the president to resign. I hear you very clearly agreeing with them. Do you think, though, that there should be, as these women have called for, a bipartisan investigation, or are you calling for an immediate resignation?
What's happening, friends? Welcome to Dr. John Podcast right now. Every accountability mechanism in the American system is activating simultaneously. Congress demanding resignations, courts issuing contempt findings, state judgments nearing $750 million, international bodies closing in, and career officials walking out in droves. This isn't speculation. It's an administration under siege from every direction at once.
I think he should immediately resign. And if he doesn't, we should have the investigation.
I wonder whether you read anything different into some of the prominent women around the president. It was quite extraordinary over the weekend when his own UN envoy, Nikki Haley, said, quote, that these women who accuse anyone should be heard and they should be dealt with. I know that the president, was elected, but women should always feel comfortable coming forward and we should all be willing to listen to them. Is there a movement on his own side, do you think, now, amongst women?
Well, I think the point she's making is that this is a very powerful moment in America's history. And not only should women be heard, but they should be believed and they should be investigated. So when you have these allegations coming forward, those allegations should be investigated, just like you would invest any other allegation of fraud or any other crime committed. Why do we not believe women? Why do we not investigate their allegations? And so they should be believed and they should be investigated as a...
Let me start with the Senate, because what is happening in that chamber right now would have dominated headlines for months in any previous political era. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, a member of the Armed Services Committee with access to classified briefings and detailed operational knowledge, stood before the cameras and demanded the resignation of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. This is not a backbench member of the opposition party making noise for the folks back home.
Consequence. And so I think President Trump should be held accountable. And that's why I think these women are coming forward, because they want that accountability. They see CEOs being fired on the spot for this kind of behavior and worse. And President Trump has committed assault, according to these women. And those are very credible allegations of misconduct and criminal activity. And he should be fully investigated and he should resign.
So before I move on to Roy Moore, the Republican candidate for the Senate special election in Alabama, can I first ask you about what you sort of started in the Senate regarding your own Senator Al Franken and also in Congress with John Conyers, a long-time congressman. You say they should resign. Why was it not okay for you to wait for the ethics investigation process to take its course? What was the tipping point for you and the other women?
Well, this was very heartbreaking for all of us. We worked well with Senator Franken, and it was hard for us personally. But when we heard about the 8th allegation, it was just too much, and I felt enough was enough. These were credible allegations from multiple sources.
This is a senator with direct oversight responsibility for the Pentagon, someone who has been briefed on the operational details that the public never sees, calling for the head of the Defense Department to step down. The basis for her demand is not a policy disagreement about force structure or procurement priorities. It is something far darker. It is about the systematic dismantling of the infrastructure that protects civilians during military operations. It is about orders that match language specifically prohibited under the Geneva Conventions.
And, having a debate about what's the difference between sexual assault and sexual harassment and unwanted groping, if you're having that debate and trying to split hairs, you're really having the wrong conversation. None of this behavior is okay. And I wanted to finally speak my mind on that issue. And that's why I expressed myself as I did with my op-ed and talked about how I see this issue. I don't think we should be having a conversation splitting hairs about different conduct. And to me, it was enough, and I wanted to express myself, which is what I did.
Can I ask you, Senator, you have made it a cause and you've been very prominent in trying to level the playing field for women across the board in their professional endeavors. Military, I said, on campus, I've said, and now in Congress, in the Senate. Has it ever happened to you?
No, I have been blessed that I've never had to feel that sting of a harasser or a sexual assault and have to relive those moments publicly like so many brave women and men have. But what we can't lose sight of, Christiane, in this moment is there are so many women around America who can't tell their story. There are so many low-wage women who are on hourly wages, whether they're working in bars or restaurants, in service industries, on farms across America. And
it is about a chain of command that appears to have decided that the distinction between combatant and civilian, the distinction that lies at the heart of the laws of armed conflict, no longer applies. Senators Elizabeth Warren and Chris Van Hollen amplified this pressure with a formal letter to Hegseth that should be read in full by every American who cares about what their country does in their name.
Their bosses aren't famous like Harvey Weinstein. They can't see accountability be held in the public eye when these allegations come out, and they may never see justice, and they may never feel they're in a position to come forward. And that's why I'm grateful for all these women who are coming forward and asking for accountability and trying to hold President Trump accountable for his outrageous conduct.
I want to dig down a little bit because obviously you Democrats have forced two of your own prominent members to resign before even the ethics investigation. And the exact opposite is being seen on the other side of the aisle. I just spoke about Roy Moore. President Trump has now got right behind him. I mean, is this a political matter in that they want the seat, they want it to pass their agenda, and they are just going to go for it?
Well, I don't think this should be a political matter. It's about doing the right thing. And it's about holding Congress accountable, holding Congress to the highest standards, not the lowest standards. And I hope voters in Alabama reject Roy Moore because of the allegations of pedophilia are horrendous. I think these allegations are credible. I hope that voters will vote for Doug Jones, somebody who has dedicated his life to public service and justice for all. And I hope they will reject him as someone who's not fit.
The letter, sent through official Senate channels with the weight of Congressional Oversight Authority behind it, cited the New York Times analysis documenting Iranian schools and hospitals reduced to rubble. It cited the Pentagon's own preliminary inquiry, an internal investigation that confirmed American responsibility for a strike on a school that killed 168 human beings.
To serve in the U.S. Senate.
I mean, it is mind-boggling. The world is really riveted. How could somebody with that many accusations, including allegations of going after minors, actually almost be about to be elected to the U.S. Senate? Now, a senior Republican, the senator from Alabama, Richard Shelby, has said, I couldn't vote for Roy Moore. The state of Alabama deserves better. But you've got a woman, a female senator, Senator Susan Collins, saying, if the allegations are known prior to the election, we have a tough decision to make about whether it's our role as senators to overturn the will of the people. What's going to happen if he joins you in the U.S. Senate?
Well, I hope that there will be an ethics investigation, and I hope I'll actually have an opportunity to vote to not seat him. I hope they will make a recommendation to expulsion, which is a role they can take. But I think Senator Shelby's right when he says, I couldn't vote for this person and this person shouldn't be in the U.S. Senate. Again, elected leaders should be held to the highest standards, not the lowest, and we should be fundamentally valuing women. And that's what this larger conversation is about. Do we value women? Do we make a space for them to come forward? The MeToo movement is a powerful movement, and we want to make sure it's a lasting movement and that it's not just this moment in time.
120 of them children. The senators asked specific, answerable questions. They wanted to know what percentage of civilian casualties resulted directly from American operations. They wanted to know how many civilians had been injured over the course of the war. They wanted to know why civilian protection teams, the specialized units whose entire function is to prevent exactly the kind of atrocity that occurred at that school, had been cut by approximately 90% before the operation launched.
But we reflect on how do we treat women? Do we value women in our communities? And then empower more women to be heard. And I also hope this continues to drive more women to run for office. We have seen overwhelming numbers of women running for office in the last election. And we need to change the player list, whether it's in Congress or whether it's in corporate America or whether it's in small businesses, so that we women can not only change this climate, but hold the perpetrators of this horrible behavior towards women accountable.
Look, I need to ask you this because it's suddenly starting to bubble to the surface, including women. There was a big article in the American Interest newspaper magazine, basically saying, quote, that there could be a backlash. Mass hysteria has set in. It's become a classic moral panic, one that's ultimately as dangerous to women as to men. In other words, the idea that, a hand on a knee is being held to the same standard as a rape or a serious abuse. Are you worried about that?
I'm not worried about that. I think we all know what kind of conduct is unacceptable. It is not acceptable to harass people that work for you. It is not appropriate or acceptable to...
These are not rhetorical questions designed to score political points. These are the kinds of questions that congressional oversight was designed to produce, the kinds of questions that previous administrations of both parties have answered because the constitutional relationship between the legislative and executive branches demands it. And the Trump administration's response to these questions has been telling. It has not provided substantive answers. It has not engaged with the factual allegations. It has responded by attacking the senators.
Attack a woman to have unwanted groping, unwanted kissing, throwing them up a sentence against a wall. You can just list the behavior. It's not hard to understand. And I hope that this country is strong enough, is thoughtful enough to have this conversation and take from it that we must value women and men who are also victims of sexual violence. We need to value one another. We need to care about one another. We need to treat each other with respect. We're not asking for something more than that. And so I hope that people do not feel they need to retaliate against women or exclude women, because that would show that we are not up to this moment. We should be big enough to handle this moment and create safe workplaces and places where men and women can thrive together. That's what makes our economy grow. That's what makes our country strong. We should be up to this moment. And so I would just urge everyone not to make an excuse in some way to see this as a retaliation against women. We should absolutely avoid it, and we should just stay strong. Women should be heard. They should keep coming forward and aspire to positions of power where they can change the players list and change the climate.
Senator, can I ask you one last question about what Democrats stand for? You probably read the leading article in the Washington Post today.
Publicly, while ignoring the substance of their inquiries. That pattern of evasion, of treating legitimate oversight as an enemy action to be deflected rather than a constitutional obligation to be honored, is itself a form of accountability pressure, because it documents an administration that cannot defend its conduct on the merits.
And it basically said, in recent weeks, you've scored huge electoral wins in Virginia, cultivated public opposition to the Republican tax plan, purged 2 liberal senators, all of that, but still can't agree on what the party stands for. What does the party stand for? And are you a potential candidate in 2020 for the presidential race?
No, but what we stand for is we care about one another. We believe that if you work hard every day, your work should be rewarded. We believe every American should have a right to the American dream, that if you work hard every day, you can work your way into the middle class and provide for your kids, that I care about your kids as much as I care about my own. That is what we stand for. We have always stood for that. And so whether we're fighting to reward work in this country with national paid leave or equal pay or affordable daycare or universal pre-K, or whether we're valuing all of us by fighting for women's voices and making sure we are all valued in this country, that is what we stand for. We have always stood for that. And it is a moment in time where we have extraordinary candidates that are coming forward, and a lot of them are women, first-time candidates winning in record numbers, certainly in the last election in November, and even in this next election in 2018, we have more women candidates than we've ever had in the history of this country.
You're so passionate. Why wouldn't you run?
Now let us shift to the criminal justice system, because what has happened in New York belongs in a chapter of history that future generations will study as the moment when the legal system finally caught up with a man who had spent decades believing he was untouchable. A jury of 12 American citizens, selected through a process that Trump's own lawyers participated in and shaped, sat through weeks of testimony and examined more than 200 exhibits. They saw the checks signed in Trump's own hand, checks labeled as legal retainer payments that were nothing of the sort. They saw the reimbursement scheme laid bare, the reimbursement to Michael Cohen for the $130,000 paid to Stormy Daniels in the waning days of the election campaign. They saw the business records that had been falsified to conceal the true nature of the payments. And after deliberating on the evidence, 12 ordinary citizens, a cross-section of the community that Trump once dominated, returned 34 guilty verdicts, unanimous. Every count, every juror, 34 felony convictions for falsifying business records in the first degree. The first criminal conviction of an American president, delivered not by a partisan tribunal or a hostile foreign court, but by the same criminal justice system that has processed millions of cases before and will process millions more after. The conviction stands on the record, unaffected by the federal immunity ruling, because state prosecutions operate in a separate sovereign sphere that the Supreme Court's presidential immunity doctrine does not touch. The sentencing has been deferred, but the conviction itself is permanent. It cannot be erased by a press release or a social media post. It exists, and it will exist forever, as a factual determination by a jury of his peers that Donald Trump committed 34 felonies. The federal judiciary has been no less active in documenting the administration's relationship with legal boundaries. Judge James Boasberg examined the deportation flights to El Salvador and found something that should shake every American who believes that we live in a nation of laws rather than a nation of men. The administration had invoked the Alien Enemies Act, an 18th century statute whose text simply does not support the sweeping deportation authority the administration claimed. Multiple courts examined the legal justification and found it wanting. The courts issued orders. They told the administration to turn the planes around. They told the administration to halt the deportations while the legal questions were properly adjudicated. And the administration faced a choice that goes to the heart of constitutional governance. It could comply with the court orders even while disagreeing with them and pursuing appeals through the normal legal process, or it could ignore the orders and proceed with the deportations anyway. The administration chose defiance. The planes did not turn around. The deportees were delivered to CCOT, the terrorism confinement center in El Salvador, a facility whose conditions have been extensively documented by human rights organizations as severe and deeply troubling. Judge Boasberg looked at this sequence and made a probable cause finding for criminal contempt. He determined that the defiance was willful, that it was not an accident or a miscommunication or a good faith disagreement about the scope of the order. It was a deliberate decision by executive branch officials to disregard a federal court's command. That finding is now part of the permanent record. It may yet be converted into formal contempt charges. And it documents, in the dry but devastating language of a federal judicial order, that this administration has been willing to treat court orders as advisory suggestions rather than binding commands. The illegal appointment of Lindsay Halligan as the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia adds another layer to this pattern of institutional misconduct. Federal Judge Cameron Curry examined the procedures used to install Halligan after the previous U.S. Attorney refused to pursue the prosecution of James Comey that Trump had been publicly demanding. What Curry found was that the administration had circumvented the vacancy laws that Congress specifically enacted to prevent exactly this kind of maneuver. The procedures were not just irregular, they were illegal. The appointment was invalid, and the consequences were immediate and concrete. The cases that Halligan had been pursuing against Comey and James, the cases that Trump had publicly demanded, collapsed. They were tossed because the person bringing them had no legal authority to do so. Two high-profile prosecutions that the administration had invested significant political capital in pursuing were wiped off the docket by a federal judge who applied the law as written. And this was not an isolated incident. 7 different states have faced challenges to U.S. attorney appointments. Halligan in Virginia, Haba in New Jersey, where the Third Circuit issued a ruling, Chadha in Nevada, Iselli in Los Angeles, Murray, who resigned in Delaware, Delaware, Cerrone challenged in New York, and Ellison challenged in New Mexico. The pattern that emerges from these challenges is not of occasional administrative errors, but of a systematic approach to staffing federal prosecutorial offices that prioritized speed and political loyalty over compliance with the laws governing appointments. The federal judiciary has responded by striking down these appointments where they have been challenged, creating a body of precedent that will constrain future administrations regardless of party. The civil fraud judgment against Trump and the Trump Organization adds a financial dimension to the accountability pressure that is staggering in its scale. Judge Arthur Engoron's ruling came in at approximately $464 million, but that figure is only the starting point. Post-judgment interest accrues at New York's statutory rate of 9% per year, and that interest compounds. Within months of the initial judgment, the total liability had climbed past $500 million. By the current moment, with interest continuing to accumulate, the exposure approaches $700 million. Trump posted a bond of $175 million to prevent immediate collection while he pursues appeals. But that bond is a temporary shield, not a permanent resolution. New York Attorney General Letitia James has filed the judgment in counties where Trump owns marquee real estate, creating liens against Trump Tower, against 40 Wall Street, against Trump Park Avenue, against the Seven Springs estate, against the physical manifestations of the wealth and success that Trump has spent a lifetime branding. Those liens mean that these properties cannot be sold or refinanced without the judgment being satisfied. They represent a direct financial constraint on a man who has always used his real estate holdings as the foundation of his financial empire. And this is before we even consider the separate judgment in the Carroll case, where $88.3 million in jury verdicts sit in escrow pending a Supreme Court decision on Trump's petition for certiorari. The Trump media stock collapse has knocked more than $1 billion off his net worth. The cumulative financial pressure on the empire is unlike anything any sitting American president has ever faced. The defections from within the Department of Justice deserve their own extended analysis because they reveal something that financial judgments and contempt findings can only imply. More than 230 DOJ lawyers and agents have departed in a single year, according to Justice Connection reporting. These are not political appointees who serve at the pleasure of the president and cycle in and out with each new administration. These are career professionals, people who have spent their entire working lives in federal law enforcement, people who have served under administrations of both parties, people whose institutional knowledge and expertise cannot be replaced by hiring loyalists from outside. Senior career prosecutor Maureen Comey was forced out and stated publicly that fear is the tool of a tyrant. Federal prosecutor Robert McBride was fired for refusing to pursue the case against James Comey. Federal prosecutor Ben Aree was fired over a tweet. Federal prosecutor Troy Edwards resigned in protest. The cumulative loss of talent, of experience, of institutional memory represents a hollowing out of the Department of Justice that will affect federal law enforcement for a generation. The agency's capacity to pursue complex cases, the kind of cases that require years of investigation and deep expertise in areas like financial fraud and public corruption and national security, is being degraded in real time. The people who knew how to build those cases are walking out the door, and the people replacing them are being selected for their willingness to follow orders rather than their ability to uphold the law. The Supreme Court's own internal dynamics have produced some of the most striking documentary evidence of institutional concern. Justice Sonia Sotomayor's dissent in the immunity case contained language that will echo through history. She wrote that the relationship between the president and the people he serves has shifted irrevocably, that in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law, and she concluded with the words, "With fear for our democracy, I dissent." That dissent has been quoted in campaign advertisements, in academic analysis, in congressional hearings, and in the public discourse of a nation grappling with what it means when its highest court declares that the president possesses a sphere of absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote separately about what she called a law-free zone, a conceptual space where presidential conduct exists beyond the reach of any accountability mechanism. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, herself a Trump appointee, wrote a partial concurrence that specifically rejected the majority's evidence rules, demonstrating that even within the court's conservative bloc, there was significant discomfort with the breadth of the immunity doctrine. And outside the court, Prominent conservative legal scholars like Judge J. Michael Ludig have publicly criticized the ruling, adding intellectual weight to the concerns that the dissenting justices articulated. The cumulative judicial concern, expressed in opinions and dissents and public statements by judges across the ideological spectrum, represents a qualitative shift in how the American legal establishment views the relationship between presidential power and accountability. The international response has been equally significant and will have consequences that outlast any single administration. Switzerland, a nation that has maintained official neutrality since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, took the extraordinary step of declaring that American and Israeli strikes on Iran violate international law and the United Nations Charter. 200 years of neutrality were broken by conduct that the Swiss Federal Council determined could not be met with silence. The president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Mirjana Spoljaric-Egger, called administration threats to civilian infrastructure the most alarming she had encountered. More than 100 international law scholars signed a letter warning that the strikes may constitute war crimes. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, condemned the attacks. This is not a coordinated political campaign. This is the independent judgment of multiple international legal bodies and authorities, each arriving at similar conclusions through their own analysis of the same documented conduct. The practical implications for post-presidency travel and liability are significant. Universal jurisdiction principles allow certain crimes to be prosecuted in national courts regardless of where they were committed. The documentary record being assembled by these international bodies will not disappear when administration officials leave office. It will remain waiting in the legal systems of countries that take a broader view of criminal jurisdiction than the United States does. The Susie Wiles admission is the kind of piece of evidence that prosecutors dream about. The White House Chief of Staff, the person who manages the day-to-day operations of the executive branch, told Vanity Fair that the prosecution of Letitia James was Trump's retribution. One retribution. Those two words, spoken by the person best positioned to know the motivations behind administration actions, confirm what critics have been arguing all along. The federal prosecutorial apparatus was being deployed not to enforce the law impartially, but to settle personal scores. The admission essentially confirms the pattern of political prosecution that has been documented across multiple cases. It could become evidence in future legal proceedings examining whether the Halligan situation and similar episodes involved deliberate misconduct rather than mere procedural errors. The most dangerous statements in any investigation are often the ones made not under interrogation, but in moments of casual candor when people who know the truth forget to guard their words. Wiles forgot to guard her words, and the result is a public admission that documents the underlying motivation for actions that the administration has otherwise tried to defend as legitimate exercises of prosecutorial discretion. The accountability landscape that has emerged is multi-institutional in a way that the framers of the Constitution would have recognized. Criminal prosecution at the state level produced 34 felony convictions that federal immunity cannot touch. Civil litigation produced judgments approaching $700 million that constrain financial operations regardless of political power. Congressional oversight through the Gillibrand resignation demand and the Warren Van Hollen letter and other inquiries asserts the legislative branch's role in scrutinizing executive conduct. Federal judicial rulings, from Boasberg's contempt finding to Curry's appointment reversal to the Supreme Court's tariff decision, demonstrate that the judiciary retains the capacity to impose limits, even on an administration that has tested those limits repeatedly. International legal positioning creates accountability structures that extend beyond American borders and beyond the temporal limits of any single administration. Internal defections from career officials document the institutional erosion that accompanies the pursuit of political prosecution. No single mechanism is sufficient on its own. The federal immunity ruling forecloses certain paths of accountability at the federal level, but the mechanisms that remain, operating simultaneously and across different institutional domains, create a cumulative pressure that is greater than the sum of its parts. The question that will define the next chapter of this story is not whether the documented conduct occurred, The court records, the Senate correspondence, the international declarations, the jury verdicts, the financial judgments, the internal admissions, all of it exists on the public record, and none of it is seriously disputed in its factual particulars by anyone who has actually engaged with the evidence. The question is whether the American people and their representatives will act on what the documentation reveals. The mechanisms exist. The evidence has been assembled. The institutional responses have been documented. What remains is the political will to use the tools that the system provides. The framers designed a government of separated powers, with each branch possessing the means to check the others, precisely because they anticipated moments like this one. The question now is whether their design is resilient enough to function under the pressure it is currently facing. The documentation suggests that it is. The contempt findings, the conviction, the judgments, the oversight demands, the international responses, all of it represents a system fighting to maintain its integrity against sustained assault. The outcome of that fight is not yet determined, but the battle lines are clear, and the evidence is on the record for all to see.